Max Verstappen's shocking spin in Hungary was not a simple driving mistake. His Red Bull was losing rear aerodynamic grip, lap after lap, until the car became almost impossible to control. He still qualified 6th, but finished more than half a second behind Lando Norris on pole. Then, after spinning at the final corner, Verstappen said the car was completely broken aerodynamically, and getting worse every lap. That is the key. This was not one bad corner. It was not ordinary tire wear. The car itself was degrading through the session, and the warning signs had already appeared across 3 consecutive sessions. What finally caused the spin exposes a much deeper problem inside Red Bull, because Verstappen was not fighting one unstable moment. He was fighting a car that kept changing beneath him. Subscribe to the channel. To understand why that spin matters, you have to understand what Verstappen was feeling before the car finally snapped. This was not a car that felt bad in one corner. It was a car that became less predictable every time he went back out. At the beginning of the weekend, Verstappen already knew something was wrong. In the first practice session, he said the Red Bull felt as though he were driving with the handbrake on. That is not a small complaint. For a Formula 1 driver, the car has to respond immediately. The moment the steering turns, the front should react. The rear should follow. The entire machine should feel connected. But Verstappen was describing the opposite. The car felt restricted, heavy, reluctant. Then, in the second practice session, the problem moved into an even more dangerous area. He reported rear locking under braking. That means the rear wheels were losing stability when he tried to slow the car down. Imagine running at full speed, then suddenly feeling your shoes slide just as you try to stop. You can still stay upright, but every step becomes a gamble. And this is where the warning signs started connecting. First, the car felt as though it was being held back. Then the rear became unstable under braking. By qualifying, the problem had evolved again. Now, the car was losing rear aerodynamic grip. That rear grip is what helps keep the car planted through fast corners. Air moves around the bodywork, pushes the car toward the track, and gives the driver the confidence to carry enormous speed. When that grip disappears, the rear begins to feel light. The driver turns into the corner, but the back of the car does not follow cleanly. It starts to slide. Sometimes the driver can catch it. Sometimes the car gives enough warning. But Verstappen's problem was worse than that. The behavior was changing lap after lap. That meant he could not rely on what the car had done before. A corner that felt manageable on one lap could become dangerous on the next. A braking point that worked earlier could suddenly place the car on the edge of control. And that is terrifying for any driver, even one as naturally aggressive and precise as Verstappen. Because confidence in Formula 1 is built through repetition. You brake at the same point. You turn with the same movement. You feel the same response. Then you push a little harder. But Verstappen could not build that rhythm. The car kept changing. And every change moved in the wrong direction. That is why his radio message was so important. He did not say the tires were finished. He did not say he had made one mistake. He said the car was broken aerodynamically and getting worse and worse. Those words reveal exactly why the final corner spin happened. Verstappen was not simply over the limit. The limit itself was moving. Think of it like walking across a floor that becomes more slippery with every step. At first, you adjust. Then you shorten your stride. Then you slow down. But eventually, one movement that felt safe seconds earlier sends you sliding. That was the danger inside the Red Bull. And it created an impossible choice. Verstappen could back off and accept a weaker qualifying position. Or he could keep pushing, knowing the rear of the car might no longer behave the way he expected. In the final part of qualifying, there was no comfortable option. He was already fighting for position. The session was running out. Lando Norris had set the standard at the front. And Verstappen needed one final lap to improve. That is when the pressure became extreme. He entered the final corner knowing he had to commit. But commitment only works when the car gives something back. This time, it did not. The rear lost stability. The car rotated. And the lap was gone. But the spin itself was only the visible moment. The real failure had been building for hours. That is why Red Bull's response matters. Laurent Mekies came onto the radio and told Verstappen that the team understood what he was feeling. That was not a technical solution. It was an attempt to contain the frustration. Because by that point, Verstappen had already used the word undrivable earlier in the weekend. Now, after the spin, his language became even harsher. He called the situation a joke. And that tells you how little trust he had left in the car. A driver can accept a slow car. A driver can work around tire wear. A driver can even adapt to a balance problem. But a car that changes from lap to lap is different. That car removes certainty. And without certainty, every corner becomes a question. Will the rear hold? Will the grip disappear? Will the car respond the same way it did before? That is why Verstappen finished qualifying in 6th place, more than half a second behind Norris. The number matters. But the reason behind it matters more. Because the gap was not only about speed. It was about confidence, control, and a car that became less stable as the session continued. And there is one more detail that changes how we should see the spin. This was not the same problem linked to Verstappen's earlier crashes during the season. Those incidents were connected to the rotating rear wing system known as Macarena. This time, the failure was different. The rear of the car simply kept losing aerodynamic support. No single dramatic mechanical break. No obvious part flying away. Just a progressive loss of control that became worse, lap after lap, until the final corner exposed it. And that is much harder to solve. A broken component can be replaced. A visible failure can be identified. But when the aerodynamic balance fades progressively, the team must find out why the car is changing while it is still running. That can involve airflow, ride height, bodywork behavior, rear stability, or the way several systems are interacting together. The source confirms the progressive aerodynamic loss. It does not identify one exact failed component. And that uncertainty is precisely what makes the situation so dangerous for Red Bull. Because Verstappen now has to start the race from 6th place. On a circuit where overtaking is difficult. With a car he has already described as aerodynamically broken. And if the problem continues over a full race distance, the qualifying spin may not be the worst moment of his weekend. It may only have been the warning. But the spin did not only destroy Verstappen's final qualifying lap. It changed the session for everyone behind him. The moment the Red Bull rotated at the final corner, yellow flags appeared. And in qualifying, yellow flags can erase a driver's chance instantly. Kimi Antonelli was directly behind Verstappen. He entered the affected area while the warning flags were active, and that immediately placed him under investigation by the governing body for potentially failing to reduce his speed enough. George Russell was also caught in the disruption. He had to lift off the accelerator as he crossed the yellow flag zone, which meant his own lap was compromised by a problem that had started inside Verstappen's car. That is how quickly one unstable rear end can spread consequences across the grid. Verstappen loses control. The yellow flags appear. The Mercedes drivers react. One lap is damaged. Another driver faces an investigation. And suddenly, a Red Bull aerodynamic problem becomes a major qualifying story for several teams. But here is what makes this even more important. Verstappen's spin happened at the final corner. That is the last place a driver wants trouble during a qualifying lap. Every earlier corner has already been completed. Every braking point has already been survived. Every small gain has already been collected. Then, just before the finish line, everything disappears. There is no next sector to recover the time. There is no second chance inside the lap. The work is gone. And for Verstappen, that meant 6th on the grid. He finished with a lap of 1 minute, 17.725 seconds, more than half a second behind Lando Norris on pole. In Formula 1 qualifying, more than half a second is enormous. It can be the difference between controlling the race from the front and beginning the afternoon surrounded by cars with completely different strategies. At the Hungaroring, that matters even more. The source does not provide a detailed race simulation or overtaking forecast, so the exact impact cannot be stated as a certainty. But one thing is clear. Starting 6th gives Verstappen far less control than starting near the front. He will have more traffic around him. More cars to manage. More chances for the tires and race strategy to become complicated. And all of that is happening while Red Bull still has to understand why the rear aerodynamic performance deteriorated throughout qualifying. That is the real emergency. The spin can be replayed. The lap time can be measured. The grid position can be confirmed. But Red Bull still needs to identify why the car became worse with every run. Because Verstappen's own explanation was unusually direct. He said that when the tires degrade, a driver can understand the problem. Tires naturally lose performance. That is part of racing. But when the car itself appears to degrade, the situation becomes much more serious. That statement reveals the difference between normal loss of grip and what Verstappen believed he was experiencing. With tire degradation, the driver expects the change. Grip falls gradually. Braking distances increase. Cornering speed reduces. The team can often see the pattern and plan around it. But Verstappen was describing something deeper. The aerodynamic behavior of the car was deteriorating inside the same session. That means the balance he felt on one lap could not be trusted on the next. And this creates one of the hardest problems a driver can face. A driver does not control a Formula 1 car by reacting only after it moves. At those speeds, that is too late. The driver must predict what the car will do. He must know how much the rear will rotate. He must know how quickly the grip will arrive. He must know whether the car will remain stable when he releases the brake and turns toward the apex. All of that depends on trust. Not emotional trust. Mechanical trust. The confidence that the car will respond in a familiar way. Verstappen did not have that. The car kept giving him a different answer. And once that happens, even the smallest uncertainty becomes dangerous. Imagine walking down the same staircase several times, but one step changes height every time you use it. On the first attempt, it is normal. On the next, it is slightly lower. Then it is higher. Then it moves beneath your foot. Eventually, the problem is not your ability to walk. The problem is that you can no longer predict the staircase. That was the situation Verstappen was describing. He was not simply pushing too hard in a familiar car. He was pushing a car whose rear behavior was becoming increasingly unfamiliar. And that explains why his frustration sounded so intense. Immediately after the spin, Verstappen said the car was completely broken aerodynamically. He said it was getting worse and worse. Then he called the situation a joke. Laurent Mekies responded over the radio. He told Verstappen that conditions were extremely difficult and that the team understood what he was feeling. But those words could only acknowledge the problem. They could not fix it. And Verstappen's reaction suggested that acknowledgement was no longer enough. This was already the third consecutive session in which the rear of the Red Bull had created concern. During the first practice session, the car felt as though it were being held back. During the second practice session, Verstappen reported rear locking under braking. Then, during qualifying, the instability became a progressive loss of rear aerodynamic grip. Each session raised the severity. First, the car felt slow and restricted. Then, the rear became unstable during braking. Finally, the rear lost enough support to send the car into a spin.